I told you all. He doesn't belong here. Get him out. The white passenger, Brielle shouted at the young black boy seated in first class. The entire first-class cabin had erupted into mayhem. Passengers were shouting, phones were recording every second, and flight attendants were desperately trying to restore some semblance of order. Somebody call 911. This black kid needs to be arrested immediately, another passenger shouted. Soon, the cops arrived ready to arrest the black kid. Little Michael Ashworth, the black kid, looked up through his tears at all the angry faces surrounding him. He was completely overwhelmed, terrified and confused about how his quiet flight to Boston had turned into this nightmare. His innocent, bewildered eyes stared back at the crowd. He whispered the most heartbreaking words you could ever imagine. I didn't do anything, please, but something happened in less than 5 minutes. The same woman who was demanding this child's arrest began begging for mercy when she realized she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. If you stand against injustice, make sure you hit that subscribe button, type yes, and tell us where you're watching from, because this story is about to take the most shocking turn you've ever seen. This is the story of how one woman's racism and desperate attempt to frame an innocent child led to the most spectacular downfall you'll ever witness. But to understand how we got to this moment of chaos, we need to go back 3 hours earlier, when this flight began as just another ordinary trip from Los Angeles to Boston. Michael Ashworth. This wasn't just any 8-year-old boy. Michael lived in Beverly Hills, California, and as he walked through, dressed in a crisp shirt and perfectly pressed khakis, he looked like any other well-dressed child traveling with family. But Michael was traveling completely alone, and there was something extraordinary about what he was carrying. While other kids his age were playing video games or watching cartoons on their tablets, Michael was quietly working on doctoral-level calculus problems. We're talking about mathematical equations that challenged PhD students at top universities. This wasn't some gifted kid doing advanced homework. This was a certified genius whose mathematical abilities had stunned professors across the country. You see, Michael wasn't just flying to Boston for a vacation. He was the son of Donovan Ashworth, the billionaire CEO of Ashworth Technologies, one of the most powerful tech companies in America. But more importantly, Michael had just become the youngest person in history to be inducted into the Mathematics Hall of Fame. At his young age, he had achieved what most mathematicians could only dream of in their entire careers. As Michael settled into his first-class seat 1A, he pulled out his tablet and continued working on calculus problems that would make your head spin. He was humble, quiet, and completely focused on his passion for numbers. He had no idea that in just a few hours, his love for mathematics would be the only thing keeping him sane during the worst experience of his young life. But Michael wasn't the only passenger with a story that day. Brielle Covington, a 45-year-old woman who was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. Brielle worked as a mid-level marketing manager at Ashworth Technologies. Yes, the same company owned by Michael's father, though she had no idea who the little boy in seat 1A really was. Brielle's life was falling apart. She had just been demoted after what her supervisors called disastrous quarterly results. Her job was hanging by a thread, and she was desperate to save her career. That's why she was on this flight to Boston, attending a conference where she hoped to impress executives and somehow salvage her professional reputation. But here's what made Brielle truly dangerous. She carried 2 phones. Her work phone, like any normal employee, but also an untraceable burner phone that she kept for what she called emergencies. This wasn't paranoia. This was preparation. Brielle had deep-seated racist beliefs about what she called the natural social order, and she believed that successful black people were somehow threats to the way things should be. As Brielle boarded the plane and saw Michael sitting confidently in first class, every prejudice she held began to bubble to the surface. In her mind, there was no way that child belonged in that seat. But they weren't the only people on that plane whose actions mattered. There were other passengers who would play crucial roles in this unfolding drama. Temperance Rodriguez was the flight attendant assigned to first class that day. Unlike what you might expect, Temperance was a progressive woman who genuinely believed in fairness and treating all passengers with respect, regardless of their age or appearance. She would soon find herself in the position of having to defend a child against adult prejudice. In seat 3C sat a quiet man named Marcus Stone. To everyone around him, he appeared to be just another businessman flying to Boston. But Marcus was actually an undercover federal air marshal, trained to observe everything and intervene when necessary. He had no idea he was about to witness a crime in progress. Crawford Chen, an elderly businessman, represented the kind of passenger who made quick judgments based on appearances. He would soon find himself questioning everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. And finally, there was Serafina Williams, a young mother traveling with her phone, always ready to record. She started the flight as a neutral observer, but she was about to capture footage that would change everything. As Flight 447 prepared for takeoff that morning, none of these people knew they were about to be part of a story that would expose the ugliest side of human nature, and ultimately prove that truth and justice can triumph over hatred and prejudice. But the real drama was about to begin when Brielle Covington decided that an 8-year-old boy didn't deserve his seat in first class. Brielle walked directly to Michael's seat and stood over him like a predator sizing up its prey. Her voice was aggressive, demanding, filled with the kind of entitlement that only comes from years of believing you're superior to others. "Excuse me, but you're sitting in my seat. Move to the back where you belong." Michael looked up from his calculus problems. Remember, this was an 8-year-old working on mathematics that would challenge PhD students, and politely showed her his boarding pass. "Ma'am, this is seat 1A. That's what my boarding pass says." But Brielle wasn't interested in facts. She wasn't interested in boarding passes, or airline policies, or basic human decency. Her racist mind had already decided that this black child didn't belong in first class, and she was going to make sure everyone knew it. "I don't care what that fake paper says," she screamed, her voice rising to a level that made other passengers look up in alarm. "Children like you don't fly first class. I'm a business executive. I deserve this seat more than some random kid." That's when flight attendant Temperance Rodriguez stepped in. Remember, Temperance was one of the good ones, a progressive woman who believed in fairness and treating all passengers with respect. "Ma'am, I've verified his ticket multiple times. The young man's reservation is completely legitimate." But Brielle was just getting started. The racial attacks that came next were so vicious, so full of hatred, that they're hard to listen to even now. "This is ridiculous!" she shrieked, her face turning red with rage. "Check his credit card. Check his ID. There's no way his family can afford this. It's probably stolen." Michael began to tear up, not from anger, but from confusion and hurt. His small voice trembled as he tried to explain. "My dad's assistant bought my ticket. I'm going to Boston for a math competition." But Brielle had already poisoned the well. She had planted seeds of doubt and suspicion, and now other passengers began to turn against the child. Crawford Chen, that elderly businessman who should have known better, looked at Michael with growing suspicion. "The lady has a point," he said, his words like daggers to the little boy's heart. "Seems very unusual for a child to be alone in first class without proper supervision." Other passengers began murmuring agreement. You could see Michael's face changing as he realized that the entire cabin was turning against him. He was becoming increasingly isolated, increasingly scared, and increasingly aware that his skin color was being used as evidence of wrongdoing. Brielle sensed the support and pounced on it like a shark smelling blood in the water. "Exactly. Something is very wrong here. I demand you move him immediately." This wasn't just about a seat anymore. This was about Brielle's deep-seated belief that there was a natural social order. that successful black people were somehow threats to the way things should be. In her twisted mind, an 8-year-old black child sitting confidently in first class was an affront to everything she believed about racial hierarchy. But here's what makes this story even more infuriating. Michael wasn't just any child. He wasn't just some kid who happened to have a first-class ticket. This was a certified mathematical genius, the son of a tech billionaire, flying to receive the highest honor in mathematics. And none of that mattered to Brielle Covington because all she could see was the color of his skin. As the confrontation escalated, as more passengers joined Brielle's racist chorus, little Michael sat there working on calculus problems that would stump university professors, tears quietly rolling down his cheeks, wondering what he had done wrong. He had no idea that things were about to get much, much worse. He had no idea that the woman standing over him screaming about his fake ticket and stolen seat was actually an employee of his father's company. And he definitely had no idea that she was about to commit a crime so calculated, so evil, that it would destroy her life forever. Because Brielle Covington was about to cross a line that no decent human being should ever cross. She was about to frame an innocent 8-year-old child for theft. What happened next was so calculated, so cruel, that it's hard to believe a grown adult could do this to a child. But Brielle Covington was about to prove just how far racism and desperation could drive someone. Frustrated that flight attendant Temperance Rodriguez continued to support Michael and defend his right to sit in first class, Brielle knew she needed a new strategy. She excused herself to the bathroom, telling nearby passengers she needed a moment to collect herself. But this wasn't about collecting herself at all. This was about plotting her next move. Inside that airplane bathroom, Brielle pulled out her second phone, that untraceable burner phone she always carried for emergencies. It was an older iPhone, completely clean with no personal data, no contacts, no history. She stared at it for a moment, and that's when the most evil plan you can imagine began to form in her mind. She was about to frame an 8-year-old child. Returning to her seat, Brielle put on the performance of her life. As Michael sat quietly organizing his math worksheets, those same doctoral-level calculus problems that proved his incredible genius, Brielle pretended to stumble. "Oh, so sorry, sweetie," she said with fake sweetness as she accidentally bumped into the little boy. But during that fake stumble, during that moment when everyone thought she was just being clumsy, Brielle slipped her burner phone deep into Michael's backpack. An innocent 8-year-old child had no idea that his life was about to be destroyed by a piece of planted evidence. Then, Brielle began building her false narrative. She started chatting with nearby passengers, playing the concerned adult. "I just feel so bad for that little boy," she said with fake worry in her voice. "Where are his parents? This seems like neglect to me. What kind of family lets an 8-year-old travel alone?" She was poisoning their minds against Michael before she even made her accusation. 10 minutes passed. 10 minutes during which Michael continued working on his math problems, completely unaware that he was about to become the victim of one of the most disgusting crimes you can imagine. Then Brielle began her Oscar-worthy performance. She started frantically searching her purse, her seat area, under her chair. "My phone! Oh God, my phone is missing!" She cried out loud enough for half the first-class cabin to hear. "It has all my work contacts. My whole life is on that phone." Other passengers looked up, concerned. This seemed like a genuine emergency, but it was all an act. "I had it right here when I sat down," Brielle continued, her voice getting more frantic, more desperate. "I remember having it when I boarded. The only person who's been near my area is..." And then she did it. She pointed her finger directly at 8-year-old Michael Ashworth and said the words that would destroy his world. "That boy. When he was moving around earlier, he must have taken it." Michael looked up from his calculus problems, completely confused and innocent. "Ma'am, I haven't touched anything of yours," he said politely. "I've been working on calculus problems this whole time." But Brielle had already planted the seeds of doubt, and now other passengers began to turn against the child. Crawford Chen, the elderly businessman who had initially seemed neutral, looked at Michael with suspicion. "Son, maybe you picked it up by accident?" Kids sometimes grab things without thinking. Even Serafina Williams, the young mother, started to doubt the child. "Maybe just check your bag to be sure," she suggested. The most heartbreaking moment came when even Temperance Rodriguez, the flight attendant who had defended Michael throughout the flight, looked concerned. "Michael, honey, could you please check your backpack?" she asked gently. "You have to understand, this 8-year-old boy had done absolutely nothing wrong. He had been sitting quietly, working on mathematical problems that would challenge university professors, and now an entire airplane cabin was treating him like a criminal." With tears starting to form in his eyes, Michael opened his backpack, and that's when Brielle's planted evidence tumbled out. Her burner phone fell onto the airplane floor with a soft thud that might as well have been a gunshot. The silence lasted for exactly 2 seconds. Then Brielle erupted. "There it is, he stole my phone. I knew it, thief." She screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing at Michael like he was the most dangerous criminal in the world. The passenger outrage that followed was immediate and devastating. "I can't believe this," one passenger shouted. "He seemed so innocent," said another. "This is exactly what I expected. Criminals start young. Call the police right now." The mob mentality had taken hold. An entire airplane cabin had turned against an innocent 8-year-old child based on planted evidence and racial prejudice. Michael's world collapsed in that moment. This brilliant little boy, this mathematical genius who should have been celebrating his historic achievement, broke down completely. He sobbed uncontrollably, his small voice pleading through the tears. "I didn't take it. I promise. I don't know how it got there. I would never steal anything." But no one believed him. Not a single person in that cabin stood up for the child. They had all been manipulated by Brielle's calculated racism, and now an innocent boy was paying the price. What Michael didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone had been watching everything. Someone had seen exactly what Brielle had done. And in just a few minutes, that person was going to expose the truth in the most spectacular way possible. But first, things were about to get much, much worse for little Michael Ashworth. Shocking. The chaos in the first-class cabin had reached a fever pitch that defied belief. Passengers were shouting over each other, their voices creating a cacophony of hatred and misplaced righteousness. "Get him off this plane," someone screamed from the back. "I can't believe they let people like this in first class," shouted another. Flight attendants were trying desperately to restore some semblance of order, but the mob mentality had completely taken over like a virus spreading through the cabin. And in the middle of it all, in the absolute center of this storm of adult rage and prejudice, sat little Michael Ashworth. 8 years old, tears streaming down his face in rivers, his small body shaking with sobs that should have melted even the coldest heart. He was completely overwhelmed by the tsunami of hatred and accusations being hurled at him from every direction. This brilliant child, this mathematical prodigy who just hours before had been peacefully solving calculus problems that would challenge PhD students, was now being treated like the most dangerous criminal in America. The irony was beyond heartbreaking. Here was a child whose mind operated on a level that most adults couldn't even comprehend, being accused of the most basic and petty of crimes by people who couldn't solve a fraction of the mathematical equations he worked on for fun. That's when Captain Morrison's voice cut through the airplane's intercom system with words that would make your blood run cold and your stomach drop. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an emergency landing in Denver due to a serious security incident aboard the aircraft." An emergency landing. A serious security incident. All because of an 8-year-old child who had done absolutely nothing wrong. The passengers around Michael erupted in satisfied murmurs. "Good," said one woman, crossing her arms with smug satisfaction. It's about time someone took this seriously. Crawford Chen nodded approvingly, apparently convinced that his initial judgment had been vindicated. Even some of the passengers who had initially seemed uncomfortable with the situation were now nodding along, swept up in the collective certainty that justice was finally being served. But it wasn't justice at all. It was mob rule. It was racial prejudice dressed up as righteous indignation. It was the worst of human nature on full display at 30,000 feet. As the plane descended toward Denver International Airport, you could practically feel the tension building like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. The cabin had taken on an almost carnival-like atmosphere, with passengers excitedly discussing what they had witnessed and congratulating themselves on their role in catching a young thief. Brielle Covington sat in her seat like a queen on her throne, practically glowing with satisfaction and self-righteousness. She had successfully orchestrated the destruction of a child's life, and she was basking in what she believed was her moment of triumph. She kept turning to nearby passengers, shaking her head with fake sadness while making comments like, "I just feel so sorry for his parents, if they even care where he is." The cruelty in her voice was unmistakable, but to the other passengers, she sounded like a concerned citizen doing her civic duty. Other passengers were already mentally composing the stories they would tell their friends and family about the dramatic flight they had experienced. Some were already posting on social media, sharing sanitized versions of events that painted them as heroes who had helped expose a young criminal. The hashtags were already forming. Airline safety, justice served, caught red-handed. But Michael just sat there, small and scared and completely alone in a way that no 8-year-old should ever be. His tiny hands, when they weren't wiping away tears, continued to work on his calculus problems, because mathematics was literally the only thing that brought him comfort in this waking nightmare. Numbers don't lie. Numbers don't judge you based on your skin color. Numbers don't accuse you of crimes you didn't commit. In a world that had suddenly become completely insane, math was the only constant he could trust. He had no idea that his father was probably already moving heaven and earth to get to him. He had no idea that some of the most powerful lawyers in the country were already being activated. He had no idea that corporate security teams were already tracking his location. All he knew was that every single adult around him, adults who were supposed to protect children, adults who were supposed to be responsible and fair, believed he was a criminal. The psychological damage being done to this child in those moments is almost impossible to calculate. Imagine being 8 years old and having your entire worldview shattered in a single afternoon. Imagine learning that your skin color could be used as evidence against you. Imagine discovering that your intelligence, your achievements, your character, none of it mattered when adults had already decided what they wanted to believe about you. The plane touched down on the Denver tarmac with a hard thud that seemed to echo the heaviness and finality of the situation. The sound reverberated through the cabin like a judge's gavel, sealing Michael's fate, or so everyone thought. Within minutes, the aircraft was completely surrounded by emergency vehicles, their red and blue lights flashing and spinning like something out of the most dramatic crime scene you've ever witnessed. Police cars, ambulances, fire trucks. The full emergency response protocol had been activated for what everyone believed was a dangerous situation involving a child criminal. From his window seat, Michael could see all the flashing lights, all the official vehicles, all the uniformed personnel gathering outside. Then came the sound that will haunt anyone who hears this story forever. Footsteps. Heavy, authoritative footsteps echoing through the jet bridge like drums of war. Each step seemed to seal Michael's fate a little more completely. Detective Rivera and Officer Thompson boarded the aircraft with the kind of serious, no-nonsense expressions that told everyone they meant business. These weren't mall security guards or airline officials. These were real police officers, treating this like a high-stakes criminal situation, rather than what it actually was. The systematic persecution of an innocent child. Their hands hovered near their weapons as they surveyed the cabin, their eyes scanning for threats. The passengers sat up straighter, suddenly feeling like they were part of something important, something dramatic, something that would make a great story later. The officers' body language communicated that they were dealing with a serious criminal matter, which only reinforced everyone's belief that they had been right to suspect Michael all along. Brielle immediately launched into the performance of her lifetime, pointing dramatically at Michael like she was identifying a dangerous fugitive who had been terrorizing communities for years. "Officers, that boy stole my phone," she declared with the kind of theatrical outrage that would have been laughable if it weren't destroying a child's life. Everyone saw it fall out of his bag. "I caught him red-handed. He's been lying and denying it this whole time, but the evidence speaks for itself." The passengers around her nodded vigorously in agreement, their faces filled with the kind of righteous indignation that makes people feel important and heroic. They had convinced themselves they were witnesses to justice, key players in a dramatic story of good triumphing over evil. In reality, they were accomplices to one of the most disgusting acts of racial persecution and child abuse you could imagine. But they didn't see it that way. In their minds, they were the heroes of this story. "We all saw it," Crawford Chen added, his elderly voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. The phone fell right out of his backpack, clear as day. No question about it. Other passengers murmured their agreement, creating a chorus of false witnesses that seemed to make Michael's guilt undeniable. What came next will haunt you forever, no matter how many times you hear this story. What happened next was so wrong, so fundamentally disturbing, that it represents everything terrible about how prejudice can corrupt even our most basic systems of justice and protection. Despite Michael's age, despite the fact that he was barely tall enough to reach the overhead compartments, still young enough to need help cutting his food, the police made the decision to place him in restraints. Picture that scene for a moment. Really visualize it. Handcuffs that had been specifically designed for children being placed on the tiny wrists of a mathematical genius whose only crime was being black and first class. "You're under arrest for theft," Officer Thompson said in that cold, official voice that police officers use when they've already decided someone is guilty. His words were delivered with the same tone he would use for an adult career criminal, not for a sobbing child who weighed maybe 60 pounds soaking wet. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." The Miranda rights being read to an 8-year-old. Let that image burn into your mind. A child who should have been worried about homework and playground games was instead hearing the same words that violent criminals hear when they're arrested. The surreal nature of the situation seemed lost on everyone except Michael himself, who was living through every parent's worst nightmare and every child's most terrifying experience. But Michael wasn't silent. This 8-year-old child, this brilliant mind who had been working on doctoral-level mathematics just hours before, was hyperventilating through his tears like his entire world was collapsing, which it was. His small voice, broken and desperate, cut through the cabin like a knife. "I want my daddy. Please call my daddy. I didn't do anything wrong. Please, somebody call my daddy." The desperation in his voice should have broken every heart in that cabin. The raw, primal need for his father, the instinctive cry of a child in distress, should have made every adult on that plane question what they were witnessing. The sight of a small boy in handcuffs, calling for his father while tears streamed down his face, should have triggered every protective instinct that decent human beings possess. Instead, most passengers watched with satisfaction, believing that justice was finally being served. Some were already taking pictures and videos, planning to share the dramatic arrest on social media. Others were shaking their heads with fake sadness, making comments about what's wrong with kids these days and where are the parents, The level of cruelty was breathtaking in its casual indifference to a child's suffering. Officer Thompson looked down at this sobbing child and seemed to have a brief moment of human decency break through his professional detachment. Perhaps it was the sight of those tiny wrists in handcuffs. Perhaps it was the genuinely terrified look in Michael's eyes. Perhaps it was the way the boy kept asking for his father, with the kind of desperation that only comes from true innocence. Whatever the reason, he reluctantly agreed to make the phone call that Michael begged for. With shaking hands that could barely hold the phone steady, Michael gave Officer Thompson his father's number, a number he had memorized since he was 4 years old, drilled into him for exactly this kind of emergency, though nobody could have imagined an emergency quite like this one. "Sir, this is Denver Police Department," Officer Thompson said into his radio, his voice carrying the routine authority of someone who had made thousands of these calls. "We have your son Michael in custody. He's been arrested for theft on Flight 447. "Yes, sir. We'll wait for you." But there was something different about this call. Something in Officer Thompson's voice changed during that conversation. A subtle shift in tone that suggested the person on the other end wasn't responding the way he expected. The officer's eyebrows furrowed slightly. His posture straightened. There was a pause, then another pause. He asked the person on the other end to repeat something. Then he asked for the spelling of a name. Then he asked for confirmation of information that seemed to surprise him. None of the passengers noticed these subtle changes. They were too busy congratulating themselves on their roles in catching a young criminal and sharing their versions of events with anyone who would listen. But if they had been paying attention, they might have noticed that Officer Thompson's confidence seemed to waver slightly after that phone call. They might have seen him exchange a meaningful look with Detective Rivera. They might have observed him quietly radio for additional information about the flight's passenger manifest. What followed were 20 minutes of pure, concentrated agony. 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours. 20 minutes that probably aged Michael by 20 years. The plane sat motionless on the Denver tarmac like a prison, while Michael remained handcuffed in his seat, still crying softly, still trying to process how his exciting trip to Boston had turned into his worst nightmare. Even in handcuffs, even while sobbing, Michael continued to look at his math worksheets because they were literally the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. And Brielle? Brielle was having the absolute time of her life. She walked around the first-class cabin like she was some kind of conquering hero, like she had personally saved the airline industry from the threat of 8-year-old mathematicians. She told anyone who would listen, "This is what happens when parents don't teach children right from wrong. I've seen this pattern before. They start stealing young and just get worse and worse as they get older. Someone needed to nip this in the bud before he became a real danger to society." The casual racism in her words was staggering. The way she talked about an 8-year-old child like he was a hardened criminal, the way she attributed his supposed criminal behavior to his upbringing and, by extension, his race. It was textbook prejudice, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed she was performing a public service. The way she positioned herself as the victim and the hero simultaneously was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. She had destroyed a child's life, traumatized an entire family, and caused an emergency landing of a commercial aircraft. And somehow, in her mind, she was the one making sacrifices for the greater good. But here's what Brielle Covington didn't know. Here's what none of those passengers knew. Here's what even the police officers didn't fully understand yet. During those 20 minutes of waiting, something absolutely extraordinary was happening behind the scenes. Something that would change everything. Something that would expose the truth in the most spectacular and devastating way possible. Phone calls were being made. Not just any phone calls, but the kind of calls that move mountains and shake foundations. Corporate security teams were being activated. Legal departments were being mobilized. Private jets were being fueled. Resources that most people couldn't even imagine were being deployed with military precision and billionaire efficiency. If you're feeling outraged and heartbroken with this story, hit that subscribe button, because this story is about to take the most incredible, most satisfying, most absolutely spectacular turn you have ever witnessed. Justice was coming for little Michael Ashworth, and it was coming in a way that would destroy everyone who had participated in his persecution. The reversal of fortune that was about to unfold would be so complete, so devastating, so perfectly poetic, that it would restore your faith in karma and the power of truth. The sound started as a distant rumble, barely audible over the airport noise. Then it grew louder and louder. 3 black SUVs with heavily tinted windows were racing across that Denver tarmac at speeds that would make your head spin, their engines roaring like mechanical beasts, their tires squealing against the asphalt. These weren't ordinary vehicles. They were the kind of high-end, bulletproof, government-grade SUVs that only the most powerful people in the world travel in. And the man stepping out of the lead vehicle, the man who was about to walk onto that airplane and turn this entire situation upside down in the most devastating way possible, was someone whose mere presence would make every person who had tormented his son wish they had never been born. You see, while Brielle was celebrating her victory, and while those passengers were patting themselves on the back for helping catch a thief, they had no idea that they had just messed with the wrong family. They had no idea that the quiet 8-year-old boy they had tormented, humiliated, and traumatized was about to be revealed as someone whose father could destroy all of their lives with a single phone call. They had no idea that their victim was the son of one of the most powerful men in America. They had no idea that justice was about to be served in a way that would make their heads spin and their hearts stop. The cavalry was coming. And when Donovan Ashworth walked onto that airplane, everyone who had participated in the persecution of his son was about to face consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Then it happened. The moment that would change everything. The moment that would expose the truth and deliver justice in the most spectacular way imaginable. Those 3 black SUVs that had been racing across the Denver tarmac came to a dramatic halt just outside the aircraft. The engines went silent, but the tension in the air was electric. Car doors slammed shut with the kind of authority that makes your spine tingle. And then, stepping out of the lead vehicle like something from a Hollywood movie, came a man who radiated power, wealth, and barely contained fury. Donovan Ashworth stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. But it wasn't his clothes that commanded attention. It was his presence. This was a man who owned boardrooms, who made decisions that affected millions of lives, who could move markets with a single phone call. And right now, every ounce of that power was focused on one thing: protecting his son. Behind him emerged a small army of people who looked like they meant serious business. Corporate security personnel who moved with military precision. Lawyers carrying briefcases that contained enough legal firepower to level entire companies. These weren't just employees. These were some of the most expensive, most dangerous professionals money could buy, and they had been activated for one purpose only. The footsteps that echoed through the jet bridge this time were different from the heavy police boots that had boarded earlier. These steps had a different rhythm, a different authority. They belonged to a man who was used to people jumping when he entered a room, used to commanding respect and obedience, used to getting exactly what he wanted. When Donovan Ashworth stepped onto that airplane, the very air seemed to change. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Passengers who had been chattering excitedly about the dramatic arrest suddenly fell silent. Even the police officers straightened up, sensing that someone very important had just entered their crime scene. His voice, when he spoke, cut through the cabin like ice-cold steel. "Officers, I'm Donovan Ashworth. That's my son you have in handcuffs. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Every passenger heard the name Ashworth, but most didn't immediately make the connection. They were still processing the fact that this obviously wealthy and powerful man was claiming the little thief as his son. But Brielle Covington heard that name, and her world began to crumble in real time. You could literally watch the color drain from her face as recognition dawned like a horrific sunrise. Her mouth fell open, her eyes went wide with terror, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Wait, Mr. Ashworth, oh my God, you're..." She couldn't finish the sentence. The magnitude of what she had done was hitting her like a freight train. The little boy she had tormented, humiliated, and framed for theft wasn't just any child. He was the son of her boss. Not just her direct supervisor, not just some mid-level executive. He was the son of the CEO, the owner, the man who could destroy her life with a single word. Crawford Chen, the elderly businessman who had been so quick to judge Michael, gasped audibly as the pieces fell into place. That's the CEO of Ashworth Technologies. That's a billionaire. The reaction throughout the cabin was immediate and devastating. Passengers who had been so confident in their righteousness just moments before suddenly looked like they wanted to disappear into their seats. People who had been taking pictures and videos quickly put their phones away, realizing they might have just recorded themselves participating in the persecution of one of the most powerful men in America's son. But the bombshells were just getting started. What happened next was so perfectly timed, so dramatically satisfying, that it seemed almost scripted by the universe itself. The quiet passenger in seat 3C, the man who had been sitting silently throughout this entire ordeal, observing everything but saying nothing, suddenly stood up. Marcus Stone had been so unnoticeable that most passengers had forgotten he was even there. But now he was reaching into his jacket, pulling out credentials that made Detective Rivera's eyes go wide. "Agent Marcus Stone, Federal Air Marshal," he announced, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of federal law enforcement. "I've been observing this entire flight for security purposes, and I need to inform everyone present that I have witnessed a serious federal crime." The cabin fell into absolute silence. You could have heard a pin drop. Every eye was fixed on Agent Stone as he continued speaking, his words falling like hammer blows on Brielle's crumbling world. "Ma'am," he said, looking directly at Brielle with the kind of stare that could melt steel, "I have video evidence of you planting that phone in this child's backpack." Brielle's face went from white to green. Her legs seemed to buckle slightly. The elaborate lie she had constructed, the performance she had given, the mob she had created, all of it was about to be exposed by an unimpeachable witness who had recorded everything. Agent Stone pulled out his phone, and on the screen was crystal clear footage of Brielle's accidental stumble. But from his angle, from his professional surveillance perspective, it wasn't an accident at all. You could see her deliberately reach into Michael's backpack. You could see her carefully plant the burner phone. You could see the calculated, methodical way she executed her frame job. "Here's footage of you deliberately placing your burner phone in his bag during your fake stumble," Agent Stone announced, showing the screen to the police officers. "I have the entire incident documented from multiple angles." Brielle's world was now in complete free fall, but she wasn't going down without a fight. Desperation made her voice shrill and hysterical. "That's impossible. He stole my phone. Everyone saw it fall out of his bag. You're all conspirators. This is some kind of setup." But Agent Stone wasn't finished. He was methodically destroying every aspect of her lie with the precision of a federal investigator who had been doing this for decades. "Furthermore," he continued, "this phone shows it was factory reset 3 days ago. No contacts, no personal data, no usage history, no photos, no text messages, nothing. It's a throwaway phone you purchased specifically for this purpose. This wasn't a spontaneous theft accusation. This was premeditated fraud designed to frame an innocent child." The technical evidence was devastating, and undeniable. Brielle had been caught red-handed by someone whose testimony could convict criminals in federal court. Her elaborate plan, her racist scheme, her attempt to destroy a child's life, all of it had been recorded and documented by one of the most credible witnesses possible. But Donovan Ashworth wasn't content to let the federal agent do all the talking. His voice boomed through the cabin with the kind of authority that made corporate executives tremble. Let me make sure everyone on this aircraft understands exactly what has happened here. His words carried the weight of billions of dollars and decades of power. When Donovan Ashworth spoke, people listened, whether they wanted to or not. My son Michael is a certified mathematics genius. He's the youngest person ever inducted into the Mathematics Hall of Fame. He's traveling to Boston to receive that honor, an honor that no 8-year-old in history has ever achieved. This brilliant, innocent child was on his way to make history, and instead, he's been traumatized, humiliated, and criminally framed by adults who judged him based on nothing but the color of his skin. The words hit the cabin like physical blows. Passengers who had been so sure of Michael's guilt were now forced to confront the reality of what they had done. They had participated in the persecution of a mathematical prodigy, a child genius, whose achievements surpassed anything most of them would accomplish in their entire lives. But Donovan wasn't finished. The most devastating revelation was yet to come. This woman, Brielle Covington, he continued, his voice dripping with ice-cold fury, works for my company. She is, or rather was, an employee of Ashworth Technologies. She racially profiled my 8th son, then deliberately framed him for theft to cover her own prejudice. She used a burner phone to manufacture evidence against a child. She turned an entire airplane cabin into accomplices to her racist persecution. The impact of those words was like a nuclear bomb going off in slow motion. Brielle wasn't just some random passenger who had made a terrible mistake. She was an employee who had committed crimes against her boss's son. The professional implications, the legal consequences, the personal destruction that was about to rain down on her was beyond anything she could have imagined in her worst nightmares. If you were in Donovan's shoes, what would you have done? Would you get Brielle arrested and terminate her appointment as a punishment? Or will you just let the event slide and give her a strict warning? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more stories like this. Donovan turned to face Brielle directly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of cold, calculated fury that could destroy empires. Miss Covington, you are terminated immediately. Not just fired, terminated with cause, with no severance, no references, no possibility of future employment within any company in our network. Our security team will escort you from all company properties. Our legal department will pursue criminal charges for child endangerment, filing false police reports, fraud, and any other charges that can possibly be applied. We will use every resource at our disposal to ensure you face the maximum possible consequences for what you have done to my son. The corporate nuclear option had been deployed. Brielle's career, her reputation, her entire future had been obliterated in a single paragraph. But it wasn't just about her job. Donovan Ashworth had the kind of influence that could make her unemployable anywhere in her industry, possibly anywhere in the business world. The passengers who had supported Brielle, who had joined her racist mob, who had participated in Michael's persecution, now looked absolutely mortified. The courage they had felt when they were part of a group had evaporated completely now that they realized they had been attacking the son of a billionaire. Crawford Chen, the elderly businessman who had been so quick to judge, looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Mr. Ashworth, I owe your son a sincere apology. I was completely wrong. I should never have. I'm so sorry. Serafina Williams, the young mother who had recorded parts of the incident, was frantically deleting her videos, ashamed that she hadn't defended the child when he needed an ally. Other passengers were staring at their shoes, desperate to avoid eye contact with Donovan Ashworth, hoping somehow that they wouldn't be remembered as part of the mob that had tormented his son. But the most powerful moment, the moment that redeemed everything, the moment that showed the true character of both father and son, came when the handcuffs were finally removed from Michael's tiny wrists. Donovan embraced his son with the kind of fierce protectiveness that only a parent can understand. His voice, which had been cold and commanding when dealing with the adults, became soft and warm when he spoke to Michael. "I'm so proud of how you handled yourself, son. You showed them who you really are. You kept your dignity when everyone around you lost theirs." Michael, still emotional but finally safe in his father's arms, looked up with those innocent 8-year-old eyes that had seen too much cruelty for one day. "I just wanted to solve my math problems and go to Boston, Daddy. I don't understand why she hurt me." Those words, "I don't understand why she hurt me," spoken by a mathematical genius who could solve doctoral-level equations but couldn't comprehend adult prejudice, were perhaps the most heartbreaking and powerful words spoken during the entire ordeal. They captured the innocence that had been attacked, the confusion that racism creates in young minds, and the simple humanity that the adults on that plane had forgotten. The transformation in the cabin was complete. What had started as a mob scene against an 8-year-old thief had been revealed as the racist persecution of a mathematical prodigy by adults who should have known better. Justice had been served not just through legal consequences, but through the complete moral vindication of an innocent child and the total destruction of those who had wronged him. And as father and son embraced in that airplane cabin, surrounded by the wreckage of Brielle Covington's life and career, it was impossible not to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe delivers exactly the justice that evil deserves. The wheels of justice move swiftly and without mercy. Within hours of Agent Stone's revelation, Brielle Covington found herself in handcuffs, real handcuffs, not the child-sized restraints that had been placed on innocent Michael. The irony was poetic and devastating. The woman who had demanded an 8-year-old be arrested was now facing multiple felony charges that would destroy her life forever. Detective Rivera, who had initially treated Michael like a criminal, now had the uncomfortable task of arresting the real perpetrator. The charges were staggering: child endangerment, filing false police reports, fraud, conspiracy, and federal charges for interfering with air transportation. Agent Stone's testimony, combined with his crystal-clear video evidence, made conviction absolutely certain. Legal experts predicted Brielle would face 2 to 5 years in federal prison, followed by massive civil lawsuits that would bankrupt her for the rest of her life. But her legal troubles were just the beginning. What happened next would ensure that Brielle Covington's name became synonymous with racist persecution and corporate misconduct forever. Agent Stone's footage didn't stay contained on a federal device for long. Within hours, the video had been released through official channels and exploded across every social media platform on Earth. The headline that accompanied it was devastating in its simplicity. Corporate executive frames 8-year-old math genius. Turns out he's her boss's son. The video went viral faster than anything in internet history. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, every platform was flooded with the footage of Brielle planting evidence in a child's backpack, followed by her racist tirade, followed by the spectacular revelation of Michael's true identity. The hashtag Justice for Michael began trending worldwide within 6 hours, accumulating millions of posts from people expressing outrage at what they had witnessed. But it wasn't just the social media explosion that made this story global news. Major news networks picked up the story immediately. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, BBC, every major outlet was running wall-to-wall coverage of what they called the most shocking case of racial profiling and child abuse ever caught on camera. International news services translated the story into dozens of languages. This wasn't just an American story anymore. It was a global symbol of how prejudice could corrupt even the most basic principles of justice and human decency. The public reaction was swift and merciless. Brielle's name, her photo, her entire history became public knowledge overnight. Her LinkedIn profile was flooded with thousands of condemnatory messages. Her social media accounts, before she desperately deleted them, were bombarded with people expressing their disgust at her actions. She had become the most hated person on the internet, and rightfully so. But while Brielle's world crumbled, Michael's story was just beginning its most beautiful chapter. 3 days after the airplane incident, Michael Ashworth walked onto the stage at the Mathematics Hall of Fame ceremony in Boston. The standing ovation that greeted him was thunderous, lasting nearly 5 minutes. Every person in that auditorium, professors, mathematicians, researchers, academics, was on their feet, applauding not just his mathematical achievements, but his courage, his dignity, and his grace under the most horrific circumstances imaginable. When Michael finally stepped up to the microphone to give his acceptance speech, the auditorium fell completely silent. This 8-year-old boy, who had been handcuffed and humiliated just days before, spoke with a wisdom and maturity that brought tears to every eye in the room. "Some people judge you before they know your heart," Michael said, his young voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "But math doesn't lie, and neither should people. I forgive those who hurt me, because that's what makes us better." The simplicity and profound wisdom of those words from an 8-year-old child left the audience speechless. Here was a boy who had every right to be angry, bitter, and traumatized, instead choosing forgiveness and hope. The standing ovation that followed lasted even longer than the first one, with many audience members openly weeping at the incredible grace displayed by someone so young. The impact of Michael's story extended far beyond that auditorium. Donovan Ashworth, inspired by his son's experience and determined to prevent other children from suffering similar persecution, announced a complete transformation of corporate policies at Ashworth Technologies. The company became a model for anti-discrimination practices, implementing the most comprehensive bias training programs in corporate America. But the most significant announcement came 2 weeks later. The creation of a $100 million scholarship fund specifically designed to support gifted minority children who might face the kind of prejudice Michael had encountered. The fund would provide not just financial support, but also mentorship, protection, and advocacy for brilliant young minds who might otherwise be overlooked or persecuted because of their race. The ripple effects were extraordinary. Brielle's actions had inadvertently sparked a nationwide conversation about bias in corporate America. Companies across the country began implementing mandatory bias training programs. Airlines revised their policies for handling passenger complaints involving children. Federal legislation was introduced to provide additional protections for young travelers. What had started as one woman's racist persecution of a child had ultimately led to systemic changes that would protect countless other children in the future. The irony was perfect. Brielle's attempt to harm Michael had actually made the world a better place for gifted children of color everywhere. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.